And of course, over the weekend, Keir Starmer saying the Reform Party policy is racist, with the inference that everybody who supports it is racist. They're obsessed with the man.
Look, I'm no genius, but if the number one issue affecting the country right now is immigration, way even above and beyond the cost of living and the economy and the NHS, if that is the number one issue that more and more people are turning themselves on to worrying about as we have more and more fighting age men spreading out across the country and horrible stories coming out to the point where the NHS over the weekend said, actually, cousin marriage is good because it might be good for the economy to keep all that wealth inside your first cousin marriage, and all these other horrendous stories that we're seeing as a result of mass migration. And you're the government and you're getting an absolute pounding in all of the polls. I'm not sure that all those people you need to win back, that calling them all names and calling them all racist if they believe that immigration is too high is necessarily the best kind of vote winning policy I could ever come up with. I'm not sure that's going to be a vote winner for them, mate.
And James Price, the astonishing thing about it is that Shabana Mahmood, of course, the Home Secretary, is due to give a speech, we believe, in around about 5 minutes' time. Live picture on your screen now of another speaker as we anticipate the arrival of Shabana Mahmood. She's basically going to deliver a policy for the Labour Party, which sounds ostensibly pretty identical to that of Nigel Farage.
No, absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? Is the Prime Minister or the Chancellor or David Lammy, are they going to call the Home Secretary racist for daring to suggest that people who come to this country and stay in this country shouldn't have criminal records, for example, or that they should be net contributors, or that they should, be decent characters in general? Is that going to be considered racist? No, look, this thing is absolutely insane. And I think the Labour Party is massively panicking because they've forgotten that they only won by default last year, and they are treading water. They've not got any kind of plan inside government. They haven't got closer to having a plan. They've already wasted a year in which all they've done is put up taxes, ruin the economy even more, ruin public services even more, and now they're just resorting to calling people names. And again, I'm no political genius, Martin, but if your big problem is an incredibly charismatic person called Nigel Farage, that you probably shouldn't go and use the big platform you've got at your conference to keep saying the man's name over and over and over again and saying he's going to do lots of horrible things. Oh, by the way, we're actually going to copy him. Again, doesn't seem like a big vote winner to little old me.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And wasn't it also telling there at the top of David Lammy's speech that he introduced Angela Rayner as a working class hero and got a round of applause? A working class hero had to resign over a 40 grand unpaid stamp duty bill.
Yeah, absolutely astonishing, isn't it? They're not sending their best in the Labour Party anymore. I think this is a real problem, and I think that's not limited just to their members of the cabinet, but that poor lad that Chris Hope was asking questions of just then in what seemed like maybe his first ever media interview. Yeah, just going, well, what really matters is delivery, as if that that hasn't just been come up with by ChatGPT or something. I don't know where they keep finding all these people to fill Labour seats and to wear the little red rosettes, but they haven't got any clue about what's happening in the world. And as they're going on and on and on about Palestine as if that's the most important issue in the world, they're not talking about future technologies. They're not actually coming up with any plans to fix the economy. They're not talking about the threat of China. They're not even talking about the Ukraine war. They're not talking about any of the substantive things that a state should be getting ready for the 21st century. Instead, they're just looking inwards. And then, as you say, David Lammy trying to rehabilitate a woman who, in Angela Rayner, I can't even get the sentence out, in Angela Rayner, who was caught with her hand in the till, borrowing her son's trust money that she got when they sued the NHS, which Labour is supposed to love, by the way, and trying to rehabilitate her as a working class hero. The whole thing smacks of a government that is on its last legs after a kind of long and painful decade in office, rather than it being, just over 12 months. The whole thing is pretty desperate at this point.
Well, James Price, just for the benefit of those tuning in, viewers and listeners, we are waiting for Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, to give a highly anticipated speech in as far as we're expecting it to set out the route to smashing the gangs, the route to finally deporting people, the route to finally showing that the country is tough on immigration. And the leaks that we've seen, the advanced sightings of this, it ostensibly seems to be the Reform Party's policy without quite as many deportations. James Price, let's get back to something else that you mentioned there. I think it's exactly right. There was a very interesting essay in the Telegraph over the weekend about how the Labour Party has simply hemorrhaged working class voters over the years since Gordon Brown became Prime Minister, and particularly when Ed Miliband was a leader of the Labour Party. And there's no other issue that defines that more now than the obsession with Palestine. Something like 18% of working class voters even care about the issue in their top 10 issues. And yet it was the number one policy there that David Lammy went to in his keynote speech at the Labour Party conference. And it just makes you wonder, the party that used to represent the working classes now seems to represent the student union.
Yeah, absolutely right. There was a great poll last week or the week before that confirmed everything we know. If you go to a posh private school, you're now more likely to support the Labour Party, funnily enough. And if you go to a state school or a grammar school, you're more likely to support the Reform Party or maybe the Conservatives. So that just shows how topsy-turvy all this sort of class nonsense is got to now. I don't think it matters much to people what class you're from. I think it only matters the content of your character and where you're going, unless, of course, you're a crusty old socialist at the Labour conference, and then you're still some weird Corbyn era class warrior. But you're absolutely right, Martin. Why is it that the Labour Party is going on and on and on about Gaza? Is it because they care about all the suffering? Well, I'd like to think so, but there's huge amounts of suffering going on around the rest of the world. They don't seem to be talking up the plight of the Christians in Nigeria. They don't even seem to be talking about the plight in Yemen or in anywhere else. It only seems to be in this one cause celeb issue of Gaza and Palestine. And I wonder why that is. Is it perhaps that Jeremy Corbyn is forming this silly, ludicrous Your Party with all of the Gaza independent MPs who are going to take millions of Muslim votes away from the Labour Party? Or perhaps the Green Party, although the Green Party's leader is some nutter who has said that he can make women's breasts larger through the power of hypnosis. The deputy leader of the Green Party, a nice man called Mothin Ali, is someone who bullied the rabbi of Leeds University so badly, saying that he was a child murderer, that the rabbi and his family had to go into hiding, and he's still not apologised for that. So there's another outlet there in the form of the Green Party for Muslim voters in Britain to go to. All these people have been traditionally Labour voters, leaking away from the party, just as working class voters are leaving the party, just as middle class voters who feel pretty much that they've been hoodwinked by Labour in the last general election, and they're looking at a complete electoral collapse. I'd like to think that Labour do anything based on the national interest, but as we all know, and as Andy Burnham once said before he lost one of the many leadership contests that he's lost in his career, it's the party comes first, not the country.
And James Price, another name to conjure with there, somebody else who seems to be taking an inordinate amount of bandwidth in the thought process at the conference is that man, Andy Burnham. And the Labour Party just compares, it seems, anybody they don't like to Liz Truss, even one of their own.
The Andy Burnham thing really gets me, right? He's just typical of these people in the Labour Party. Go on and on, whoa, I'm such an outsider. By gum, look at me. When he was asked what his favourite biscuit was, he said gravy. And just absolutely ludicrous guy who, went to Cambridge, became a special advisor, became an MP, was going on about people wearing fancy clothes in an interview. And when they asked what his suit was, oh, actually, it's Hugo Boss, silly me. Couldn't be more of an insider. And actually, it's that young Labour MP you had on set, he's never even had a real job before. The idea that this bloke who's running a sort of large council in Manchester is the answer to the many, many problems that the Labour Party has caused, it's absolutely laughable. And you would have to have a heart of stone not to feel a bit for the Labour Party. But fortunately, I've got a block of obsidian in my chest, and therefore I will laugh at the Labour Party and their misfortunes all day long because of the damage they're causing to this great country of ours.
And nevertheless, James, there was a message from the Chancellor Rachel Reeves earlier on saying, have faith. Our party has overcome greater challenges than this. Until our patriotic cause is realised, a better Britain is within reach. And then David Lammy keen to point out a multitude of occasions in different countries around the world, in Norway, in Canada, in Australia, where the Labour parties were written off and yet came up on the inside rail to take victory. Isn't it astonishing that 4 years out from a general election, they're already talking like that Nigel Farage is in Downing Street, and the only way of stopping them is to vote Labour Party, and don't worry, we can do it. They're only 14 months in.
The stench of death is unfortunately pretty palpable, isn't it? And actually, the Chancellor, not like her to be wrong about things, all of the economic numbers, her disastrous budget, her CV where she lied about her jobs that she's actually had, not like her to be wrong about things. But once again, I'm afraid I've got to take issue with what she said. If you look at the example in Australia, I think the Labour Party there was set to win the last two elections that it did. And if you look in Canada, the only reason that the Liberals won there was because Donald Trump started being, let's be honest, a little bit silly, talking about Canada as the 51st state, which galvanized a lot of support. And even then, the Tories in Canada actually won a huge number of seats. If they want to look finally for some international comparisons to see what they should be doing, I'd recommend they look over at the state of Denmark. And I think in Denmark, we've got a great example of there's a centre-left government in control there. And it's one of the few, I think maybe the only centre-left party in Europe, in the Western world, that has taken the issue of mass migration really seriously. It's the centre-left party in Denmark that have kicked out huge numbers of people, that have strengthened the borders, have ignored all the nonsense coming out of the EU and all of the rest of it. And as a result, there's no insurgent right party, there's no far right party, whatever on earth that means, in Denmark. Just a sensible, decent social democracy there. Now, that would be something that if the Labour Party was serious at, and they looked at that, then they might actually start making some headway. And it was one Keir Starmer who talked about Britain becoming an island of strangers. And I thought at that moment, maybe just maybe, he's starting to get that for 50 years, people have voted for the party that said that they would lower immigration only to see immigration go up every time, with the slight exception of those great Thatcher years. Maybe Starmer, maybe Reeves would start to get that all they've got to do is to substantially lower immigration. But no, Starmer comes along again and says, oh, actually, when I gave that Island of Strangers speech, I hadn't actually read it and I wasn't really paying attention. By the way, anyone who thinks what I said in that speech a few months ago, they're racist, and they're just going to keep falling back on that. And that's why they're so far behind in the polls.
And James Price, again, just to explain to viewers and listeners tuning into GB News this hour, we are presently waiting the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, to stand and deliver, as it were, her manifesto for change, for immigration, for deportations. Yeah, this is Shabana Mahmood, not Nigel Farage. And I'd like to just go over some of that detail now with you, if I could, James Price. We're hearing this will include stiff new tests to make sure you can speak commendable English. We're hearing you must have to volunteer for your local neighbourhood to prove you're invested in your locale. We're hearing you have to have a spotless criminal record to remain in Britain. Now, James Price, this sounds great, but the reality is we can't at the moment deport grooming gang rapists. We can't at the moment deport drug dealers if they don't like chicken nuggets. Is any of this well-sounding and well-meaning stuff actually going to deliver when reality bites?
I'd forgotten about the chicken nugget story. My God, absolutely unbelievable. This was alongside those same stories that they couldn't be deported because your child didn't like chicken nuggets, or there was the woman whose Latvian partner doesn't like spicy food and therefore she couldn't be deported back to the Dominican Republic, or the bloke who couldn't be deported back to Iran despite being a criminal because he was selling sex toys, and they don't look very kindly on that in Iran. These are the silly stories about the deportations we've been unable to make. But there are, of course, a lot more serious ones where people who've committed the most heinous acts that I don't frankly feel like going into at this respectable time of day cannot be deported back to their home countries, not in spite of those crimes, but because of those crimes, because some of the crimes are so unspeakable that if they went back to their home countries, they'd be treated very harshly. And so instead, we get to keep them here in Blighty forever. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. And all the stuff that Shabana Mahmood's about to say, I mean, I hope that her boss, Keir Starmer, doesn't call her a racist for daring to suggest that you shouldn't have a criminal record if you want to come from abroad into this country. Very bigoted, of course, that. But I do hope that she actually understands that unless they deal with the deep-seated legal problems that we've discussed, the Human Rights Act, the ECHR, all of this kind of thicket of power of the rule of lawyers taking over from the rule of law, none of this stuff's going to work. She's going to be a massive failure, just like everybody else has been. Not just Labour, to be fair, but politicians of all colours going back a long, long way, red, blue, whatever, because it is that thicket of the civil service and the regulators and the quangos and the lawyers and the bad laws that have been put onto the domestic statute book that, as you say, Martin, have prevented us from sending these people back. And what was the story today? That the nephew of the Taliban commander is allowed allowed to stay, and not only that, but to bring over huge numbers of his family, none of whom do speak English. And then what happens? So Shabana Mahmood comes out and says all of this stuff, and we go to deport them, and they say, hang on a minute, ECHR, now you're stuck paying for me and my several wives and several kids and all the rest of it forever and ever. And if you disagree with that, by the way, GB News viewers and listeners at home, if you disagree with the idea that we shouldn't want to have to take in the nephew of a Taliban commander and his massive family full of people that don't speak English, well, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, thinks you're a racist. How about that? James, is that going to be a vote winner?
James, I want to dwell on that point if I can, because there's been a huge amount of conversation around this. And it's also worth pointing out, you're exactly right, that the Conservative government prior to the Labour Party for 14 years were sunk in many ways by the same issues. They couldn't deport people quick enough. The ECHR was barbed wire that prevented them. They couldn't stop the boats. We've seen decades of failure, but I want to specifically focus on this racism word, because when Sir Keir Starmer said it about the policy at the weekend, a lot of people straight away thought, well, I support the policy, therefore are you calling me racist? People leapt in to defend the Prime Minister, saying, no. He wasn't calling the people who vote for reform racist, just the policy, just Nigel Farage. We thought it might go away, but the Labour Party has doubled and tripled down again today. All of their top brass have gone into bat and repeated the R word. Do the Labour Party think that this is going to work? It works in their room. There was a standing ovation about stamping out racism, a standing ovation of drawing a line between Windrush and Nigel Farage's deportation policy. But ever since the mention of the far right after Southport, and with every incarnation of mentioning racism, a part of me thinks, James Price, that the British public are just starting to switch off from that word now. It's having no impact.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like, you and I have had a bit of fun chatting about this and how absolutely ludicrous it all is. But you make a really, really serious point that there are people in this country who are racist, not nearly as many as some say, and that I think that we could all decent people would agree that judging someone based on the skin pigmentation that they have is a ridiculous thing to do. And I think that at the same time, calling everybody racist has had a really chilling effect on the kind of difficult conversations that we should in Britain be having based around people's culture. And because you can't talk about people's culture and different cultures, and I would say inferior cultures, that it's probably turned more people onto going, oh, well, then I'm just going to start judging people on their skin color. And that is obviously wrong. It's counterproductive, even if you were just being a ruthless capitalist about it. If you as a business don't hire someone because of their skin color and your opponent does or your competitor does, then they're going to do better than you. But and people will make nice arguments about different cultural elements into this country, food and things like that. It always seems to be food. And that's all great. And we want, nice French people making nice French food, and you want American tech bros, or in my case, American wives. My wife is an immigrant to this country from the United States. But we do need to have a serious conversation about the fact that when you have people from inferior cultures, and we've seen a lot of it recently, this horrible excrescence from Epping, who went up to children and said, I want to make a baby with you, who's now been charged and sentenced to prison. That's a cultural problem. And what else do you expect when you import all of these people over? But exactly as you say, Martin, if you start throwing around this R word as it is over and over and over and over again, it does lose its potency. It does lose its power. And I think that, hopefully not in Britain necessarily, but in general, I think that has a negative effect. And it's just, it's pretty similar to the story of the boy who cried wolf, really, isn't it?